What happens when Hollywood's most carefully orchestrated late-night talk show becomes the stage for an explosive confrontation that nobody saw coming? When two worlds collide in the most unexpected way, and the cameras keep rolling as tensions reach a breaking point that changes everything. This is the story of how a routine promotional appearance turned into television history, and why the aftermath is still sending shockwaves through the entertainment industry. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling us what you think really happened behind the scenes. Your engagement helps us bring you more of these jaw-dropping stories. The Jimmy Kimmel live studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. The audience had been warmed up, the cameras were positioned, and the host was reviewing his notes one final time. Tonight's guest was supposed to be a straightforward interview, a chance to promote upcoming projects and share some lighthearted moments with America's favorite late-night comedian. But from the moment the guest walked onto that stage, something felt different. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his quick wit and ability to navigate even the most challenging interviews, seemed unusually focused as he shuffled through his cards. The production team had done their homework, preparing questions that would be engaging but not too probing. After all, this was meant to be entertainment, not investigative journalism. But sometimes the most explosive moments happen when you least expect them. The guests took their seat across from Jimmy, the familiar late-night talk show setup that millions of viewers had seen countless times before. The bright studio lights, the comfortable chairs, the backdrop of Los Angeles twinkling. In the distance through the studio windows, everything looked normal, everything felt routine. But beneath the surface, tensions were already simmering. Jimmy opened with his characteristic charm, delivering his monologue with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times before. The audience laughed at all the right moments. The energy in the room was electric, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. But experienced viewers of late-night television know that the real drama often begins once the interview portion starts. As the commercial break ended and the cameras rolled again, Jimmy turned to his guest with that familiar smile that had made him a household name. The interview began innocuously enough, with questions about current projects and upcoming ventures. The guest responded with practiced answers, the kind of polished responses that come from years of media training and countless similar appearances. But Jimmy Kimmel didn't become one of late-night television's most successful hosts by sticking to the script. He had a reputation for asking the questions that other hosts might shy away from, for pushing boundaries in ways that created memorable television moments. And tonight, he was about to push a boundary that would create a moment nobody would forget. The first sign that something was amiss came when Jimmy shifted in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. The studio audience, attuned to the subtle changes in energy that happened during live television, began to sense that something was different. The guest noticed it too, their posture becoming slightly more defensive, their smile becoming a bit more forced. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone that regular viewers would recognize as his investigative mode. This was the side of Jimmy Kimmel that emerged when he was about to tackle a controversial topic or challenge a guest on something they might not want to discuss. The guest's media training kicked in, but there was something in their eyes that suggested they were preparing for a confrontation. The question that started it all seemed innocent enough on the surface, but those who understood the underlying tensions knew that Jimmy had just lit a fuse. The guest's response was measured, calculated, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there moments before. The audience could feel the shift in energy, the way the air in the studio seemed to become charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the television equipment. Jimmy's follow-up question was more direct, more pointed. This wasn't the light-hearted banter that late-night talk shows are known for. This was something else entirely. The guest's response was sharper. Now, their carefully maintained composure beginning to show cracks. The production team behind the cameras began to realize that they were witnessing something unprecedented. What happened next would be replayed countless times across social media, analyzed by entertainment reporters, and debated by fans and critics alike. The guest's carefully constructed public persona began to crumble as Jimmy continued to press on topics that were clearly off-limits. The tension in the studio was palpable, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would define both careers. The audience sat in stunned silence as the conversation escalated beyond anything they had expected when they came to see a taping of their favorite late-night show. This wasn't scripted, this wasn't planned, and this certainly wasn't the kind of entertainment they were used to seeing in this time slot. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of an exchange that was becoming increasingly heated. Jimmy's reputation for fearless interviewing was about to be tested in ways he had never experienced before. The guests' media training was being pushed to its absolute limits as they struggled to maintain control of a situation that was spiraling rapidly out of their hands. Neither of them could have predicted how this night would end, but both of them knew that there was no going back to the comfortable, predictable world of celebrity interviews. The studio lights seemed brighter, the cameras seemed closer, and the audience seemed to hold their collective breath as two of the most recognizable figures in entertainment faced off in a battle of wills that would leave lasting consequences for both of their careers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, and the cameras were still rolling. The moment of truth arrived when Jimmy looked directly into his guest's eyes and asked the question that shattered the carefully maintained facade of polite celebrity conversation. His voice was steady, professional, but there was an unmistakable challenge in his tone that made everyone in the studio lean forward in their seats. "Let's talk about the contradictions," Jimmy said, his hands folded calmly on his desk. "You've built a brand around authenticity and speaking truth to power, but there are some glaring inconsistencies between what you say publicly and what your actions actually demonstrate." The guest's smile faltered for the first time since sitting down. Their media training had prepared them for difficult questions, but there was something about Jimmy's direct approach that caught them off guard. The pause that followed felt like an eternity to viewers, but in reality lasted only a few seconds before the guest recovered their composure. "I think that's an unfair characterization, Jimmy," came the response, voice slightly tighter than before. "I've always been consistent in my message and my actions. Perhaps the issue is with how certain media outlets choose to frame my story." Jimmy's eyebrows raised slightly, a gesture that regular viewers knew meant he was just getting started. "Really? Because I have some specific examples here that might suggest otherwise." He reached for a stack of papers on his desk, a prop that immediately made the guest shift uncomfortably in their chair. The audience sensed the growing tension, their usual laughter and applause replaced by an almost eerie silence. This wasn't the Jimmy Kimmel Live they were accustomed to watching. This felt more like a courtroom cross-examination than late-night entertainment. "For instance," Jimmy continued, his voice gaining momentum, "you've spoken extensively about the importance of privacy and protecting your family from media scrutiny. Yet you've also made very calculated decisions to put certain aspects of your personal life in the spotlight when it serves your narrative. How do you reconcile those two positions?" The guest's jaw tightened visibly. Their hands, which had been resting casually on the chair's armrests, now gripped them with white-knuckled intensity. "I think you're oversimplifying a very complex situation, Jimmy. The decision to share parts of our story was about taking control of our own narrative after years of having it manipulated by others." "Taking control," Jimmy repeated, nodding slowly. "That's interesting phrasing, because from where I'm sitting it looks more like you want to control how the story is told while simultaneously claiming to be victims of that same media machine you're now using to your advantage." The guest leaned forward, their diplomatic mask beginning to slip. "You clearly don't understand the position we were put in. The relentless attacks, the racist undertones in the coverage, the complete invasion of our privacy. We had no choice but to defend ourselves." Jimmy's expression remained neutral, but there was steel in his voice when he responded. I'm not questioning the validity of those concerns. What I'm questioning is the selective way you've approached transparency. You've been very forthcoming about certain grievances, but remarkably quiet about other aspects of the situation that might not paint you in such a favorable light. The studio audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. The usual rhythm of late-night television, with its predictable beats of setup and punchline, had been abandoned entirely. This was raw, unscripted confrontation. Such as? The guest challenged, their voice rising slightly for the first time since the interview began. Jimmy consulted his notes with theatrical precision. Well, there's the matter of the financial arrangements that were made, the private conversations that were leaked to friendly journalists, the coordinated media campaign that happened to coincide with certain other family events. These aren't exactly the actions of people who simply want to be left alone. The guest's composure cracked further. How dare you suggest that we orchestrated some kind of campaign? We were responding to lies and misinformation that were being spread about us daily. We had every right to set the record straight. Absolutely, Jimmy agreed, but his tone suggested he was far from finished. But setting the record straight and launching a comprehensive media offensive are two very different things. And the timing of certain revelations, the choice of which, outlets to work with, the strategic release of information, it all suggests a level of calculation that seems at odds with the spontaneous, reactive narrative you've presented. The guest stood up abruptly, the sudden movement causing several audience members to gasp audibly. The cameras immediately adjusted to capture the full drama of the moment. I don't have to sit here and listen to these accusations. You're twisting everything to fit your predetermined narrative. Jimmy remained seated, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to his guest's visible agitation. I'm not making accusations. I'm asking questions based on publicly available information and documented timelines. If those questions make you uncomfortable, perhaps that says something about the answers. This is exactly the kind of treatment that drove us away in the first place, the guest shot back, their voice now carrying clear anger. The constant questioning of our motivations, the refusal to take our experiences at face value, the assumption that everything we do must have some ulterior motive. The host's voice remained steady. I think you're conflating criticism with persecution. Nobody is questioning your right to make the choices you've made, but that doesn't make those choices immune from scrutiny, especially when they contradict previously stated positions. What contradictions? The guest demanded, their hands gesturing emphatically. We've been consistent from the beginning about wanting privacy and respect. The fact that we've had to fight for those things publicly doesn't make us hypocrites. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. But that's exactly my point. You can't claim to want privacy while simultaneously participating in tell-all interviews, documentary series, and carefully orchestrated media campaigns. You can't position yourself as victims of media manipulation while employing many of the same tactics you criticize others for using. The guest's face flushed with obvious anger. You have no idea what we've been through. The threats, the harassment, the complete destruction of our reputation by people who never even tried to understand our side of the story. I'm not diminishing your experiences, Jimmy replied, his tone remaining frustratingly calm in the face of his guest's escalating emotion. But I am pointing out that your response to those experiences has been remarkably strategic and well coordinated for people who claim to just want to be left alone. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. The guest was standing, visibly agitated, while Jimmy remained seated behind his desk, maintaining the composed demeanor that had made him one of late-night television's most respected hosts. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, gasp, or simply try to process what they were witnessing. The guest took a step toward the desk, their voice dropping to a more dangerous tone. You're doing exactly what everyone else does. You're taking our attempts to defend ourselves and turning them into evidence of some grand manipulation. It's gaslighting, pure and simple. Jimmy's eyebrows raised again. I think that's a serious accusation to make, simply because someone is asking you to explain apparent contradictions in your public statements. If pointing out inconsistencies constitutes gaslighting, then journalism itself becomes impossible. The guest's response was immediate and sharp. This isn't journalism, Jimmy. This is a hit job disguised as an interview. You invited us here under false pretenses, claiming this would be a friendly conversation, and instead you've ambushed us with gotcha questions and character assassination. The studio fell completely silent as everyone present realized they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of an exchange that had transcended typical celebrity interview territory and entered something far more volatile and unpredictable. The silence that followed was deafening. Jimmy looked up at his standing guest, his expression unreadable, while the studio audience held their collective breath. The tension had reached a point where everyone present knew that something unprecedented was about to happen, but nobody could predict exactly what form it would take. Jimmy finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there at the beginning of the interview. I understand you're upset, but calling this a hit job seems like a dramatic overreaction to some fairly straightforward questions about public statements and documented actions. The guest's response was immediate and fierce. Straightforward. Questions? You've spent the last 20 minutes trying to paint us as calculating manipulators who orchestrated our own persecution. That's not journalism. That's character assassination with a smile. I've asked you to explain apparent contradictions, Jimmy replied, his tone remaining maddeningly calm. If those explanations make you look bad, that's not my fault. That's the natural consequence of taking contradictory public positions. The guest began pacing behind their chair, clearly struggling to contain their anger. You know what? This is exactly why we left. This is exactly the kind of treatment that made our lives unbearable. The constant second-guessing, the refusal to accept that we might actually be telling the truth about our experiences. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're conflating legitimate questions with persecution. You're suggesting that any scrutiny of your actions is automatically unfair, which is a pretty convenient position to take when you're making serious allegations about other people. Convenient? The guest's voice rose to a level that made several audience members visibly uncomfortable. You think it's convenient to have your entire life torn apart by people who have never met you? You think it's convenient to have your every word twisted and your every action questioned? The host's patience seemed to be wearing thin for the first time since the interview began. What I think is convenient is the way you've positioned yourself as above criticism, while making very serious accusations about others. What I think is convenient is the way you've monetized your grievances while claiming to want privacy. The guest stopped pacing and turned to face Jimmy directly, their eyes blazing with anger. How dare you reduce our pain to a business transaction? How dare you suggest that we're profiting from our trauma? I'm not suggesting anything, Jimmy shot back, his own composure beginning to crack slightly. I'm stating facts. You've signed lucrative deals. You've participated in high-profile interviews. You've released content that directly contradicts your stated desire for privacy. These aren't accusations. They're observable realities. The guest's voice became dangerously quiet. You have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea what it's like to have your entire existence questioned by people who have never walked in your shoes. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, something he rarely did during interviews. The physical change in dynamics was immediately apparent to everyone in the studio. And you have no idea what it's like to be accused of racism and persecution simply for asking questions that any reasonable person would ask, given the circumstances. The guest's face went pale, then flushed red with anger. There it is. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You're upset that we called out the racism and you're trying to discredit us to make yourself feel better. That's not what this is about at all, Jimmy replied, his voice rising for the first time. This is about accountability. This is about the fact that you can't make serious accusations about people and institutions and then cry foul when someone asks you to back up those accusations with something more than your word. The guest took a step toward the desk, their body language becoming increasingly aggressive. Our word? Our lived experience isn't enough for you. The documented harassment, the provable lies that were told about us, the clear pattern of different treatment? None of that matters because you've decided we're not credible? Jimmy's response was sharp and immediate. What matters is that you've built a narrative that paints you as perpetual victims while simultaneously engaging in behavior that suggests you're anything but powerless. What matters is that you're asking people to accept your version of events without question, while refusing to acknowledge any complexity or nuance in the situation. The guest's voice became a shout. Complexity? Nuance? There's no complexity in racism. There's no nuance in harassment. There's no middle ground when people are trying to destroy your life and the lives of your family. And there's no accountability in your version of events, Jimmy fired back, his own voice raised now. Everyone else is wrong, everyone else is lying, everyone else has ulterior motives. But you're pure as the driven snow, just innocent victims who never made a mistake or a calculated decision in your lives. The guest stood frozen for a moment, their face a mask of fury and disbelief. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as the confrontation reached its absolute peak. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every second of an exchange that was unlike anything in late-night television history. "I don't have to listen to this," the guest said finally, their voice shaking with rage. "I don't have to sit here and be lectured by someone who clearly made up his mind about us before we even walked through that door." Jimmy's response was immediate and cutting. "The only thing I made up my mind about was that I was going to ask you real questions instead of lobbing softball inquiries about your favorite hobbies. If that feels like a lecture, maybe that says something about how accustomed you've become to friendly interviews that don't challenge your narrative." The guest began moving toward the side of the stage, their intention clear to everyone present. "This interview is over. I'm not going to participate in this ambush any longer." "Jimmy," called after them, his voice carrying across the studio. "Walking away from difficult questions is exactly the kind of behavior that makes people question your credibility in the first place." The guest spun around, their face contorted with anger. "My credibility? My credibility? You want to talk about credibility? Let's talk about a talk show host who thinks he's an investigative journalist. Let's talk about someone who uses his platform to attack people who can't defend themselves on equal terms." "You have one of the biggest platforms in the world," Jimmy shot back. "You have access to media outlets that most people can only dream of. The idea that you can't defend yourself is laughable." The guest's final words before storming off the stage were delivered with venom. "This is exactly why we left. This is exactly the kind of treatment that made our lives impossible. You've proven our point better than we ever could have ourselves." With that, the guest strode toward the exit, leaving Jimmy standing behind, his desk in front of a studio audience that sat in complete shocked silence. The cameras followed the dramatic exit, capturing every step, as one of the most explosive late-night television moments in history reached its conclusion. Jimmy stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened, before slowly returning to his seat. The audience remained silent, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply try to process what they had witnessed. The host looked directly into the camera, his expression serious and contemplative. "Well," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and determination, "I think that speaks for itself." The studio erupted in confused applause, some audience members cheering, others clearly uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. Jimmy wrapped up the show with uncharacteristic brevity, clearly as stunned by the turn of events as everyone else present. As the credits rolled and the audience filed out, everyone present knew they had witnessed something that would be dissected, analyzed, and debated for years to come. The confrontation had revealed something raw and unfiltered about celebrity, culture, media manipulation, and the complex dynamics of public accountability. The cameras had captured it all, and now the world would have to decide what to make of an exchange that had transcended entertainment and become something far more significant and controversial. So what do you think really happened behind the scenes before this interview? Was this a calculated move by Jimmy Kimmel, or a genuine moment of journalistic integrity? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more explosive entertainment stories that you won't find anywhere else.